back in February on the website Road to VR, it's a great VR news website. Highly recommend you check them out if you haven't already. Tipatat, who is one of the founders of the Venture Reality Fund and who's been investing in virtual reality companies, startups, really early stage. Well, he was doing it when I met him in, I think, 2014 or 2015. And so he published an article in Road to VR talking about VR hitting its inflection point. And what he did was he correlated the number of reviews on websites for VR games with the revenue that ultimately was released for those games. And he showed an inflection point in 2019 where it just started cranking up to the right. And then what he did is he looked at how many games had generated over $1 million in revenue. And he's postulated that you need a platform with multiple games doing at least $1 million, especially if they're indie games, which have lower budgets, to have a viable platform. And you can see from this chart how now we're up over 100 titles that have generated over $1 million in revenue, and it's growing. Now, he also had a chart of all the games, the top games on there, and noted that these games, the top earning games, were almost all native VR titles. They were not ports of PC 2D games that people were bringing into VR, but VR really requires a new way of thinking and a new way of doing things. And lately I've been watching a lot of stuff happening in VR, and what I'm seeing is people taking old ways of doing things and bringing them into VR, and it just doesn't work. I had a conversation with Terry Schussler and Alan Smithson recently, and they were talking about needing a virtual keyboard in virtual reality. And I pushed back on that. Like, let's let go of virtual keyboards. And I think some of the ways we do things in games, and we talked about, last week we talked about AAA games and how the new control mechanisms are letting go of the old controllers. And it's kind of like Web 1.0. I'm old enough to remember Web 1.0, which was basically companies taking their brochures and putting them onto websites. Now, if you did that, people would laugh at you because there's a new way of interacting around the web. And I think VR requires that. Now, the other thing that's happening, and this was just released last week on Road to VR, is they look at headset adoption. And they're taking the Steam VR numbers that publish how many headsets are active on Steam. And we saw a massive spike that they're attributing to Half-Life Alyx, with almost 1 million headsets added to Steam. Now, platforms need a network effect. In this case, you need headsets and hardware for people to play things on, and you need content. And there's been this narrative in the virtual reality world that we need a killer app. But in essence, what we really need is we need a bunch of content that hits a bunch of different micro verticals and a lot of different use cases for a big audience, because we all want to do different things. And that combination of content leading to people buying hardware and hardware leading to people using content, which drives revenue for developers to create more content, which means more people are going to buy hardware, is actually starting to happen now. And you're seeing it. If you go try to buy a headset, good luck. I just ordered a Valve Index, and they wouldn't even take my money because they're saying we're at least 8 weeks out. Oculus Quest is sold out on all platforms. You can't even find them on eBay now. And so VR is really starting to explode, and I think we're going to see more and more of that in the future. Now, speaking of hardware, there's a Kickstarter going on right now. It's got about 2 days left, and it's the ET controller. And what these guys have done is they've taken what I think the knuckle controllers from Valve have done. They've removed the buttons, and they've created this really intuitive touch controller for virtual reality. Now, if any of you have ever been in the hardware business like I have, hardware is hard and it's expensive. Now, these guys are selling this for about $320 American. They've raised about, I want to say about 80 grand so far, which isn't a lot of money for a hardware startup, but they've already got developer kits. The developer kits are in the wild. The final product is going to sell for, I think, again, $300, and it'll be integrated with Lighthouse. And so I think you should check that out. Now, with any Kickstarter, there's risk involved, especially with a hardware startup. And so this is not an endorsement. I have ordered a set of these. I can afford to lose $300 if it happens. So be really mindful that Kickstarter is not a guarantee that the product is actually going to make it into the wild. Now, another thing that hit the interwebs last week was Sony Interactive Entertainment from their research labs showed a new controller that they're working on, which looks remarkably like the knuckle controller from Valve Index. And I think this is further evidence that PS5 distribution pipeline is getting laid. Now, PSVR is actually the biggest player in the VR industry. They've sold more than 5 million headsets, and they've done it rather quietly. You don't hear them out there bragging about it or talking about it, but it's actually driven a lot of use in VR. Now, one of the reasons that people dismiss it is because it's generally cheap, it's low quality, it's less than $200. But my expectation is that PSVR is clearly going to support PlayStation 5 is clearly going to support PSVR, and you'll see a new headset coming from PlayStation probably in 2021. Now, also, Oculus announced that they're working on a new headset, a follow-up to the Quest. Now, that's not really a surprise because every hardware company in the world that's in the technology business is constantly working on upgrades. But it was good to see confirmation. And because of supply chain challenges and the coronavirus, most people expect that headset to come out in 2021 as well. And you can expect it to be lighter, faster, probably not cheaper. They'll probably hold that price point in the $400 range.